April 1945. Detroit's Ford Rouge plant roared like a living giant at work. Steam hissed from vents in rhythmic bursts, machines clanged like distant artillery, and overhead conveyors slid with an unbroken metallic pulse. Beneath the cathedral-high girders, the air shimmered with oil and heat. Engines, row upon row of them, moved forward, each assembled by hands that never stopped. It was a war fought not with rifles, but with motion. In a line of grey uniforms marked PW, the German prisoners of war stood silent, caught between disbelief and fear. Among them, Karl Brenner, a 32-year-old engineer from Bremen, stared at the seamless coordination before him. He could not grasp it. This ocean of labor, this disciplined dance without barking officers or shouted commands. At home, they had called America lazy, disorganized, racially divided. Yet here, in the heart of its industry, he saw a different truth. Men and women working side by side, each gesture feeding the next like links in a perfect chain. The roar filled his chest. The rhythm of the line, steady, unstoppable, felt almost human. Pistons gleamed like silver hearts, belts spun faster than thought. Above the din, an American foreman raised his hand, and within seconds, an entire section of the line slowed, synchronized, adjusted, and accelerated again. No chaos, no confusion, just order. Karl blinked, half waiting for someone to shout, to command, to threaten. But there was only the pulse of machinery and laughter rising from the workers themselves. He glanced at the guard standing beside him. The man wasn't watching the prisoners. He was watching the machines, proud and unafraid. That confidence unsettled Karl more than any weapon could have. He turned to the other POWs. Some stared in awe. Others clenched their fists. Something deep within them, something carefully built by years of propaganda, began to crumble. Oil smoke drifted through the light like incense. A new sound rose above the factory floor. A bell marking shift change. The prisoners followed their guards deeper into the plant, their boots echoing against steel. The rhythm followed them, hammering not just in the walls, but in their minds. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to WW2 Tales, where real history speaks. The clang faded behind them, but its echo would haunt every mile back to the camp, where the real unraveling was yet to begin. The context begins within those fences of quiet order. The road from the Ford Rouge plant led not to freedom, but back behind wire. It was inside those silent enclosures that America held an army it had defeated without ever marching across the Rhine. By 1945, the United States was the reluctant keeper of more than 425,000 German prisoners of war, scattered across 46 states from Maine to California. The war had stretched American manpower thin, and the prisoners filled the gap, working farms, clearing forests, canning fruit, and repairing roads. Yet their captivity was unlike the brutal prison camps of Europe. Here, there was a deliberate effort, quiet but revolutionary, to win through fairness what could never be secured by force. In the flat fields of Michigan, the barbed wire compounds appeared suddenly among snow-lined trees. Fort Custer near Battle Creek, branch camps in Algonac, Owasso, and Marquette. Rows of identical huts, their windows curtained against the wind, surrounded by guard towers that rarely fired a shot. Inside, the smell of coal smoke and boiled coffee hung in the air. Prisoners rose at dawn to the sound of a whistle, lined up for roll call, then marched in groups to the mess hall, where they ate oatmeal, bread, and sometimes eggs, rations nearly identical to their guards. The Geneva Convention was not just a treaty here, it was policy, and its observance became a quiet act of propaganda. The War Department's Office of the Provost Marshal General kept meticulous records. Inspectors noted that libraries were stocked with both German and English books, that prisoners subscribed to newspapers, that they played football on weekends, and staged orchestral concerts from salvaged instruments. In one camp newsletter preserved by the Imperial War Museum, a POW wrote, "We live cleanly, we eat well, and yet we are not free. Freedom, I think, may require more than good food." Those words, meant as irony, later read like prophecy. But inside every camp ran an invisible current of ideology. Among the prisoners, cliques formed: the blacks, unrepentant Nazis; the greys, cautious pragmatists; and the whites, who quietly doubted the Reich's truth. Fights broke out over radio news from Europe. When Allied bombers struck Dresden, a camp guard recalled, some prisoners cheered, while others wept. The war had ended for them physically, but mentally they were still fighting, holding fast to a vision of Germany that was already collapsing. To manage this ideological battleground, American officers devised what they called the Intellectual Diversion Program, a plan to redirect thought itself. They brought in educators, ministers, and psychologists. They introduced lectures on democracy, discussions on ethics, and films that showed not propaganda but ordinary life: children in classrooms, farmers harvesting grain, voters queuing at polling stations. It was an education designed to erode hate through exposure, not punishment. Karl Brenner, one of the prisoners assigned to Camp Custer, found himself drawn to the camp's modest workshop, where he repaired typewriters and small engines. He wrote in his later journal, "The machines I fix do not kill, they type letters home." But in 1945, that reflection had not yet formed. At the time, his world was narrow, bordered by wire, guarded by men who neither scorned nor feared him. Outside the fences, the war raged toward its end. Newspapers pinned on the bulletin board showed advancing Allied lines and photographs of Berlin in flames. Yet within the camp, the days moved with measured predictability: work, meals, study, lights out. It was peace in miniature, but an uneasy one, watched over by the distant hum of a country still producing weapons faster than any enemy could destroy them. It was within that atmosphere of control and curiosity that a new experiment emerged, one that would take a handful of prisoners beyond the fence, not to labor, but to witness. The plan took shape inside a narrow office at the War Department's Special Projects Division in Washington. Stacks of memoranda and psychological profiles filled the desks. Each page represented a fragment of the Army's quietest campaign: re-education. It had begun as an experiment in the camps themselves, but by early 1945, the program's architects wanted something bolder, something visual. They called it the Controlled Exposure Initiative. The idea was simple: allow selected German prisoners to see the American home front with their own eyes. Let them walk through the heart of an industrial democracy and witness what Nazi propaganda had denied: a society unified not by fear, but by collective purpose. The plan's authors believed such an experience could dissolve ideology more effectively than any lecture. "Show them what America truly is," one colonel wrote in a margin note preserved in the National Archives. "They will not forget." From this paper trail of proposals, Detroit emerged as the perfect demonstration ground. The city had become the living engine of Allied victory. Within its limits, cars had transformed into tanks, bombers, and jeeps. Assembly lines once producing sedans now turned out B-24 Liberators at a rate of 1 per hour. The Ford Rouge plant, stretching over 1,500 acres, was an industrial continent unto itself, a place where raw ore entered one end, and a finished aircraft engine exited the other. Even the Nazi high command had acknowledged its mythic reputation. In German propaganda broadcasts from 1943, Detroit was described as a city enslaved by Jewish capital, its workers mindless cogs. The truth would soon dismantle those lies. Selection for the tour was deliberate. Camp officers reviewed psychological reports, seeking men of technical skill but moderate belief. Engineers, mechanics, teachers. Karl Brenner's name appeared in one such report, noted for discipline, curiosity, and no overt Nazi sympathies. Alongside a dozen others, he was quietly summoned to the camp commandant's office one late winter morning. There, through a translator, an American lieutenant explained their orders. They would travel to Detroit for an industrial observation assignment. No details, no purpose given, only that they would return before dusk. That night, in the barracks, speculation ran wild. Some whispered that it was punishment, others that they were to be interrogated or shown propaganda films. A few joked bitterly that perhaps they were to build tanks for their captors. Karl lay awake, staring at the frost creeping along the window pane. The idea of seeing an American factory, truly seeing it, unsettled him. He remembered his professors in Bremen, describing American industry as soulless. He wondered what soullessness looked like up close. The next morning, under grey skies, the chosen men stood in formation as guards distributed fresh khaki uniforms marked PW in bold black letters. Their boots had been polished, their pockets emptied, their hands inspected. The convoy awaited them, 2 olive-green buses idling beyond the gate. A gust of diesel and cold air carried the distant scent of pine and machine oil. The prisoners climbed aboard without a word. From the moment the camp fence disappeared behind them, the world widened. Snowbanks flanked the roads, telephone wires stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and every few miles they passed small towns where people waved as the buses went by. The prisoners did not wave back. They stared, trying to reconcile the simplicity of it all. Open stores, children on sleds, women carrying groceries, no bomb craters, no ruins, no Gestapo checkpoints. America, they realized, was untouched by the war's devastation. Vast, functioning, alive. A War Department observer, seated at the front of the bus, later recorded the mood. The prisoners were silent, observant, perhaps disoriented. When asked what surprised them most, one replied, "That you trust us to see this." Trust. That was the invisible message embedded in the tour. The guards kept their weapons slung, not drawn. The prisoners were treated as men, not enemies. This quiet dignity spoke louder than any speech. It was America's most subtle weapon, moral confidence. As Detroit's skyline came into view, the air thickened with smoke and the smell of oil. The distant stacks of the Rouge plant loomed like cathedrals of steel. Karl pressed his forehead to the window, his breath fogging the glass. He did not know it yet, but beyond those gates awaited the moment that would undo everything he thought he understood about power. The descent begins with the hiss of air brakes and the first sight of the factory's endless motion. February 1945. The bus hissed to a stop Outside the Ford River Rouge complex, its steel and brick expanse stretching beyond sight. Guards opened the doors, and the prisoners filed out, boots crunching over cinders dusted with snow. Ahead rose a skyline of smokestacks, gantries, and conveyor bridges that seemed to crawl across the horizon. The factory emitted a sound not unlike a living organism, a rhythmic breathing of pistons, belts, and molten steel. To men who had spent years in confinement, the sheer scale of motion was intoxicating and alien. Karl Brenner stood among them, feeling the vibration beneath his boots. The sound reached into his chest, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. In Bremen, he had studied engineering, sketching the efficiency of assembly lines on paper. But here, those lines had become something almost divine. Smoke and steam coiled into the grey sky as molten iron glowed through open foundry doors, painting the prisoners' faces in amber light. An American foreman, his sleeves rolled and safety goggles resting on his forehead, stepped forward. A translator beside him explained that this was a guided educational visit. The prisoners would see how American workers, many of them women, had taken over the front lines of production. No slogans, no posters, no officers barking orders, just work, coordinated and relentless. The group was instructed to keep hands visible and follow the marked paths. Then the gates opened and they stepped inside. The sound swallowed them whole. Conveyors rattled above their heads, delivering glowing ingots toward presses the size of houses. Each press slammed down with the weight of a falling world, shaking dust from girders. Sparks cascaded in orange sheets. At intervals, whistles pierced the roar, signaling shift changes. Overhead walkways carried women in blue overalls, their hair tucked under scarves patterned in stars. One smiled as she passed, the smallest gesture, but one that unsettled Karl more than the machinery. It broke the invisible wall between captor and captive. The foreman gestured to a row of workers assembling crankshafts. Every piece identical, the translator relayed. Every worker knows his role. That is how one factory can build an airplane every hour. The prisoners watched as a component rolled from one station to the next, touched by dozens of hands, each motion practiced to the second. No one shouted. The system itself gave the orders. For men raised in a regime that preached discipline through fear, this calm precision felt impossible. One prisoner muttered, "Where are the soldiers?" Another whispered, "Who punishes mistakes?" The translator smiled faintly, but didn't answer. Karl noticed that the workers spoke freely, sometimes laughing, even as the machines thundered. There was order here, but it was chosen, not imposed. Declassified War Department notes later revealed that intelligence officers observed the prisoners' reactions carefully. Subject reactions indicate strong cognitive dissonance, one report stated. Exposure to cooperative industrial democracy appears to contradict ingrained totalitarian frameworks. The program's creators had achieved exactly what they'd intended, but in ways no one could script. When the group reached the rolling mill, the heat struck like an open furnace. Rivers of molten metal poured from ladles into molds, sending waves of brightness across the concrete floor. The smell of scorched oil mixed with sulfur. Karl wiped sweat from his brow, his skin prickling despite the February cold outside. Above the din, he heard an American worker call to another, joking about a baseball game that night. The absurd normalcy of it, laughter beside liquid steel, lodged in his mind. The foreman led them next to the final assembly hall, a building vast enough to contain a small town. Engines lined the floor in symmetrical rows. Men and women tested gauges, checked wiring, tightened bolts. At the far end, newly finished bomber engines glistened under skylights. Carl found himself staring at one, marveling at the impossible rhythm of production that could turn raw ore into flight. He realized, with a faint unease, that he had stopped thinking of this as an enemy achievement. It was something else, a manifestation of human mastery that transcended ideology. In that moment, the motif that would haunt the rest of his captivity took shape in his mind. Motion, endless, democratic motion, work shared among thousands, all moving forward without command. It stood in brutal contrast to the rigid hierarchy of his own homeland, where motion came only from orders above. The tour continued into the foundries and tool rooms, where the air grew thick with graphite dust. The prisoners coughed, eyes watering, but no one complained. Every sight demanded attention: the smooth rhythm of a conveyor, the steady pulse of riveters, the dance of cranes, moving steel coils with mathematical grace. For the first time since capture, Carl forgot his rank, his past, even his uniform. He was simply a man watching what humans could build when allowed to cooperate freely. At midday, they were led into a cafeteria. Trays clattered, workers chattered, and the smell of coffee filled the air. POW guards sat apart but unarmed. The prisoners were served the same meal: stew, bread, an apple. It was unremarkable, but the gesture stunned them. Back home, Allied POWs in Germany ate near-starvation rations. Here, their enemies shared food. One man whispered, "They feed us like equals." Carl chewed in silence, his thoughts tangled. When they returned to the buses, the light had shifted. The sky streaked in smoke and evening haze. As the gates closed behind them, Carl looked back one last time at the factory's windows, glowing gold in the dusk. The sound faded into distance, but the rhythm stayed inside him, a phantom pulse. The return journey to Camp Custer was quieter than the trip out. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the faint clatter of the bus became the only sound between them. Outside, Michigan rolled past in wide snow-patched fields, barns leaning against the wind, telephone poles blinking by in perfect intervals. The landscape seemed to move with the same precision they had just witnessed, an invisible assembly line stretching from horizon to horizon. Carl Brenner sat near the window, his gloved hand resting on the glass. He tried to order his thoughts, but they slipped through him like sand. Everything about the Rouge plant unsettled his foundation, not just its immensity, but its calm. No whip, no shouting, no ideology, yet it functioned with an efficiency that Nazi engineers could only dream of. Back home, efficiency had been the servant of fear. Here, it seemed the servant of freedom. The War Department observer sitting near the front of the bus watched them carefully, jotting down occasional notes in a leather-bound pad. His post-war report would later describe this moment as a visible crisis of comprehension. The prisoners were not jubilant or grateful. They were shaken. To men raised to see democracy as weakness, the revelation that its power came from voluntary cooperation was more subversive than any pamphlet. That night in the barracks, when the lamps dimmed and the guards' boots faded down the corridor, the whispered conversations began. One man, a former Wehrmacht machinist named Otto Lenz, admitted he had wept during the tour. Another, still too proud to concede, muttered that it was all a show for propaganda. But even he spoke softly, uncertain. Carl said nothing. He lay staring at the rafters, replaying the image of a woman worker adjusting a piston's torque while humming to herself. She had looked content. That single image contradicted everything he had been told about American labor, the supposed chaos of democracy, the alleged exploitation of women. It had all been lies. Days passed, but the rhythm of the factory continued to echo through camp life. The clang of mess hall trays sounded like presses. The shuffle of boots during roll call became the beat of the assembly line. The other prisoners noticed it too. Their letters, later archived by censors, grew introspective. "It was not the machines that impressed me," one wrote, "but that no one was afraid." The American officers overseeing the program were cautious about these psychological ripples. They knew transformation was delicate. Too much exposure could breed resentment instead of reflection. Still, the office of the Provost Marshal General quietly expanded the initiative. Similar tours were arranged in Wisconsin, Texas, and California, lumber mills, shipyards, and farms. But Detroit remained the most striking case study because it exposed the prisoners to something beyond industry. It showed them a people who believed in purpose without command. Carl began volunteering for library duties at Camp Custer. He read voraciously, not propaganda, but manuals, newspapers, even back issues of Life. The camp's education officer, Captain Joseph Harlan, noticed the change. In a report later filed to Washington, Harlan wrote, "Subject Brenner demonstrates cognitive flexibility. He now inquires about democratic systems with sincerity rather than defiance." Such language was bureaucratic, but behind it lay something more human, the slow collapse of certainty. In the weeks following the tour, Carl found himself sketching the factory from memory. His drawings, saved in an envelope now held by the Henry Ford Museum, show intricate cross-sections of conveyor belts and press arms, annotated in precise German script. But across the top margin of one sheet, he had written a single English word, carefully underlined: motion. It became his private talisman, the rhythm of the factory transformed into a philosophy. Motion meant life, cooperation, progress. In a world shattered by ideology, it meant survival. Then came the news from Europe, rumors of Allied advances, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the bombing of Dresden. The German prisoners gathered around the radio in the mess hall, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent light. The war they had once thought eternal was collapsing. The officers in their midst tried to maintain dignity, but the younger men were restless, confused. They had seen the future in Detroit, and it did not look like the Reich. One evening, Carl wrote a letter that was later intercepted by censors and preserved in a War Department file. It read, "If Germany loses, perhaps it is because we have worshipped power, not progress. The Americans have built a machine out of freedom. I cannot yet explain it, but I have felt it." For weeks, that line circulated among officers of the Psychological Warfare Division, quoted in memos as evidence of the program's success. But for Carl, it was no doctrine, it was confession. By late spring, the snow had melted. The prisoners were allowed longer work details outside the camp, painting barns, clearing brush, even helping local farmers. Their guards treated them like hired hands rather than enemies. The contrast with the world they'd left behind only deepened. Carl began to realize that his descent was not into despair, but into understanding. The ideology that had defined him was cracking, not under interrogation, but under exposure to decency. And yet, doubt carried its own terror. At night, he would sometimes dream of the factory, the press slamming down, sparks flying, and wake with his heart pounding, unsure if he had betrayed his homeland or simply discovered another truth. The transformation had begun. What waited next was the monotony that tested whether these revelations could survive routine. The routine begins not with machines, but with silence. The long quiet of waiting, of days blending together in captivity. By the summer of 1945, Camp Custer had settled into a rhythm so precise it could almost be mistaken for peace. Dawn broke to the scrape of boots and the rattle of mess tins. The bugle called, guards counted, and the prisoners shuffled toward their work assignments under skies streaked with soft gray. For the thousands of German POWs scattered across the United States, this was life, a slow drift of days measured by labor, letters, and memory. The war in Europe was over, but the fences still stood. News of Germany's surrender had reached the camp in May. The men had gathered silently by the bulletin board, staring at the headline, clipped from the Detroit Free Press, "Germany surrenders." No speeches followed, no tears, only a collective exhale, as if the ground beneath them had dissolved. For some, surrender meant release. For others, humiliation. But for Karl Brenner, it meant a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to think without fear. Life in Camp Custer was regulated yet humane. The barracks smelled of soap and pine from daily scrubbing. Meals were steady: corned beef, potatoes, bread, sometimes a slice of pie from the camp bakery. The Geneva Convention required fair treatment, but America often went beyond it. Prisoners worked in lumber mills, on farms, and in maintenance crews. They were paid in coupons, redeemable at the camp canteen for cigarettes, stationery, or small luxuries, the simple tokens of dignity. It was within this predictable routine that the lessons from Detroit began to deepen. Karl was assigned to the camp carpentry shop, repairing furniture for the base officers. The rhythmic thud of hammers echoed like the presses of the Rouge plant, and each blow drew him back to that day of revelation. He began to see a pattern, that even captivity had its structure, its cooperative motion. The camp, in its own quiet way, had become another kind of factory, one that produced reflection. Letters home became the prisoners' lifeline. Every few weeks they were allowed to write under the watch of censors. Many asked about families, cities, where the homes still stood. But some letters shifted tone. Subtle, questioning, almost philosophical. Karl's correspondence, later archived in the National Archives POW collection, carried this new introspection. "We build things here with patience," he wrote. "The Americans say, work keeps a man from rusting. Perhaps they are right. I have not rusted." There was no overt indoctrination anymore. The lectures and films of earlier re-education programs had faded as the war ended. What remained was exposure, the freedom to observe, to choose what to believe. The camp's small library grew busier. German translations of Democracy in America circulated beside Goethe and Schiller. Prisoners argued over politics, over whether Nazism had truly failed or merely been betrayed. Some clung to pride, others sought meaning in the ruins. Among them, Karl found a companion in Otto Lenz, the machinist who had cried at the Rouge plant. They spent evenings whittling wood scraps into small sculptures: birds, hands, tools. Otto carved a miniature piston. Karl built a delicate gear that actually turned. They joked that they were recreating Detroit in miniature. Yet beneath the humor lay something solemn, a shared need to keep the idea of motion alive. The guards, many of them local farm boys, barely older than the prisoners, treated them with a curious respect. They shared cigarettes, sometimes baseball stories, sometimes silence. In a report from the Provost Marshal General's office, one officer noted that fraternization was becoming impossible to prevent, but beneficial to morale. Indeed, the camp seemed suspended between worlds, no longer a battlefield, not yet peace. Days passed in ritual, roll call, work, meal, mail, lights out. Yet within this structure, small acts of rebellion and grace took shape. One man baked bread shaped like the Brandenburg Gate. Another organized an orchestra with instruments scavenged from scrapwood and wire. On summer evenings, the sound of violins drifted through the compound, mingling with the chirp of crickets. Even the guards paused to listen. Karl began sketching again. This time not machines, but people, workers, guards, musicians. The camp laundress who always hummed an American tune. His drawings captured motion in stillness, the small economies of gesture that defined daily survival. Each line seemed to ask the same quiet question: what makes a man free? One August afternoon, as he repaired a broken table leg in the carpentry shed, a guard entered with a rolled-up newspaper. "They've dropped a new bomb," the man said. "War's over in Japan." The news rippled through the camp like a gust of wind. For the first time in years, the world was at peace, though peace for the prisoners came wrapped in uncertainty. No one knew when they would go home or to what kind of home they would return. That night, the camp orchestra played without being asked. The music drifted through the open barrack windows, gentle and melancholy. Karl sat outside, carving wood by lantern light, the rhythm of his knife matching the slow pulse of the violins. The war had ended, but inside him something was still shifting, a quiet surrender to the idea that freedom was not granted by victory, but built through trust. When he finally set down the knife, he looked toward the fence, its barbed wire glinting faintly under the moon. Beyond it lay America, vast, unknowable, in motion still. Autumn crept across Michigan like a soft retreat. The fields beyond the camp fence turned to rust and gold, and the morning air carried the faint metallic smell of distant factories. The prisoners now woke not to orders, but to habit. Work detail whistles still blew, but with the war over, their urgency had faded into routine, a hollow echo of the world they once knew. Camp Custer's boundaries had loosened. The wire still stood, but the guards' rifles rarely left their shoulders. Locals from nearby Battle Creek sometimes visited, curious about the enemy soldiers who fixed their barns or picked apples on their farms. The newspapers called it Operation Goodwill, a quiet experiment in reconciliation. For the prisoners, these civilian interactions were both privilege and torment. They revealed a life that had continued without them, unscarred and generous. Karl found solace in labor. The carpentry shop had become his sanctuary, the rhythmic scrape of plane against wood his meditation. He built tables, shelves, and even a small model of the rouge plant out of scrap pine and glue. The guards nicknamed it Little Detroit. Every cog, every girder, every belt, all carved by hand. When he finished, he placed a single matchstick figure inside, arms raised as if in awe. "That's me," he said quietly to Otto. Letters from home trickled in, brittle and stained by their long journey across oceans. Some carried good news, a mother still alive, a town spared. Others brought the unbearable. Entire streets gone, families missing. For many, the silence between letters spoke loudest. Yet even grief took on a strange rhythm, absorbed by the camp's routine. Men cried quietly, then returned to their chores as if work itself could keep despair from consuming them. The camp's chaplain, an aging Lutheran minister from Ohio, began holding voluntary discussions in the recreation hall. They were not sermons, but conversations about ethics, rebuilding, forgiveness. The prisoners came hesitantly at first, but soon the benches filled. One night, the chaplain asked what freedom meant to them. A young Luftwaffe pilot answered, "Freedom is to move without fear." The room fell silent, and Karl looked up, realizing the words mirrored his own private motif. Motion, always motion. By October, rumors spread of repatriation. Some camps in the South were already sending prisoners home via Norfolk and New York, yet others whispered of transfers to Britain or France for labor duties. The uncertainty turned the camp restless. At night, men gathered in the yard, watching the stars beyond the floodlights, wondering which hemisphere would claim them next. The guards no longer barked curfew. They understood. For Karl, each day became a test of patience. He had seen America's strength in motion, and now he faced its stillness, the waiting, the monotony, the slow erosion of identity. To survive it, he built rituals: morning coffee brewed from scorched barley, an hour of sketching after dinner, a nightly walk around the inner fence perimeter. He no longer measured time by days, but by drawings. Each page filled was a day endured. Then, one afternoon, a Red Cross truck arrived with parcels from home. Inside Karl's box was a letter from his sister in Bremen. She described ruins, streets like broken ribs, but also hope, neighbors rebuilding, children sweeping glass from doorways. "The world must begin again," she wrote. "You must come home with your eyes open." Karl folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his sketchbook. That night, as the camp orchestra played, he noticed a young guard standing near the fence, listening with eyes closed. The guard couldn't have been more than 20. Karl wondered if the boy had ever left Michigan. When the song ended, Karl approached and said softly through the wire, "You will go home soon, yes?" The guard smiled. "I am home." That answer, so simple, lodged deep in Karl's mind. A final lesson that freedom was not movement, but belonging. By winter's first frost, Camp Custer had become almost quiet. The men no longer spoke of war or ideology. They traded recipes, shared stories, and dreamed aloud about the lives waiting for them somewhere across the sea. Karl kept sketching, his lines more fluid now, less mechanical. In his final drawing of the camp, the fence was faint, almost erased by snow. Routine had turned from punishment to preparation, a slow thawing of minds once frozen by belief. Beyond those fences, ships were being readied, and orders typed. The next stage would not be work or waiting, but decision. The turning point begins with a list of names read aloud at dawn, and a silence that follows like prayer. December 1945. The camp's loudspeaker crackled under the frost, its voice brittle against the cold morning air. "Attention! The following prisoners will prepare for transfer." The list began, rolling across the yard in clipped syllables. Each name was a breath held, a heartbeat paused. For months, the men had waited for this. The moment when captivity would shift towards something uncertainly called home. But as names echoed between the barracks, not all hearts lifted. Karl Brenner's name came midway through. He froze where he stood, hands trembling in his wool gloves. Otto Lenz clapped him on the shoulder, forcing a smile. Bremen, yes, you'll see it again. But Karl couldn't answer. In that instant, the word home felt fragile, almost foreign. The man who had entered the camp 2 years earlier, an engineer, a believer in order and obedience, was not the one standing in the snow now. The camp officers explained that repatriation would proceed in stages. Selected groups were to be transferred first to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, then shipped east by rail for embarkation. Others, deemed skilled and stable, might remain temporarily as laborers assisting in post-war cleanup. The choice, for once, lay partly with them. For men long stripped of agency, even the illusion of choice was staggering. Karl's papers marked him as a Category B, cooperative, skilled. He was asked to stay another month to assist with carpentry repairs. Otto's name, however, was on the transport list. Their friendship, forged in sawdust and silence, would soon fracture along the invisible lines of bureaucracy. That night, they shared a final cigarette outside the workshop. Snowflakes melted against the embers' glow. "Maybe I'll see you in Bremen," Otto said softly. Karl nodded, though he doubted either of them would ever return to what that city had been. The next morning, the transport trucks arrived. Prisoners climbed aboard, their breath misting in the cold. Some waved, others stared straight ahead. Karl stood among the remaining few as the engines started. When Otto caught his eye through the frost-covered window, he lifted his hand in a slow salute. The trucks rumbled away, leaving only tire tracks and silence. That silence marked the camp's transformation. Without the constant expectation of departure, the remaining men drifted into introspection. The war was long over, but its echo still shaped their thoughts. Some dreamt of rebuilding Germany into something new. Others dreaded returning to a place that no longer existed. For Karl, the uncertainty was both burden and gift. His descent had stripped him of ideology, and now the emptiness demanded meaning. One evening, while repairing a cracked table leg in the officers' mess, Karl overheard 2 American sergeants talking. "They say the Germans coming back home don't believe the news," one said. "They can't imagine what their cities look like." The other replied, "Maybe that's mercy." Their words lingered like smoke. Karl began to wonder if the real shock wasn't losing the war, but seeing what had replaced it: rubble, hunger, silence. That night, he walked along the fence line, his boots crunching through crusted snow. The guard towers glowed faintly in the dark, but the floodlights were dimmed now. Beyond the wire, he could see the lights of Battle Creek, houses, a church steeple, a car passing along the road, life continuing. The contrast hurt and healed at once. He thought of the Rouge plant, the vast order of motion, the endless cooperation. That day had become the hinge of his captivity, the point where obedience turned into comprehension. The war had tried to freeze him into one belief. Detroit had melted that ice. In its place came something uncertain but alive. He realized then that his greatest fear was not returning home, but standing still again. Back in the barracks, a radio played softly. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, still echoing from before the war. Karl listened, the melody blending with the muffled breathing of sleeping men. He took out his notebook, now filled with sketches, and wrote a single line beneath the last page. "Freedom is movement toward understanding, not away from it." He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. Maybe that didn't matter. The act of writing it, of setting thought into motion, was freedom enough. Days later, an officer entered the barracks holding a folder. "Brenner," he called, "you've been approved for repatriation. Transport in 1 week." Karl felt his pulse rise. not in joy, but in weight. The final movement of this long captivity had begun. Somewhere ahead lay a fractured homeland, but between him and it stood one last test, the departure itself, the crossing that would decide whether his new understanding could survive beyond the fence. The turning point continues as the train gathers speed eastward, carrying not just prisoners, but the fragile beginnings of belief. The train cut across the flat Midwestern plains, a slow metallic serpent breathing steam into a grey December dawn. Inside the cars, the German prisoners sat wrapped in surplus blankets, their duffel bags small as regret. Each man stared through the slats at a passing world, towns with quiet stations, children waving at the tracks, billboards for Lucky Strike and Chevrolet. The United States was receding, but not disappearing. For many, it had already settled somewhere deeper than memory. Karl Brenner sat near the window, sketchbook open on his knees. His pencil traced the rhythm of the rails, long, deliberate strokes forming the silhouette of a smokestack, then a church spire, then the endless geometry of telephone poles. Across from him, another prisoner muttered prayers in broken Latin. Someone else began softly humming Lily Marlene, the forbidden melody that once carried through occupied Europe like contraband hope. At each small-town stop, American MPs stood watch as food was loaded, coffee in metal tins, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. A few curious civilians appeared along the platform edges, staring through the gaps in the railcars. Some waved, hesitant but genuine. Others turned away, unwilling to see the defeated so humanly close. Karl met the gaze of a young boy holding a small model airplane. The child raised it, grinning. Karl nodded, and for a heartbeat, the war's machinery seemed smaller than the child's gesture. That night, as the train crossed into Illinois, a sergeant distributed envelopes. Each man received one marked Personal Evaluation, Repatriation. Inside were typed notes summarizing their conduct, skills, and ideological status. Karl's sheet read simply, Cooperative, Technical Aptitude, Recommended for Reintegration. He folded it carefully, unsure whether it was a certificate of progress or a warning. By dawn, they reached Fort Sheridan. The camp was colder, harsher, a waiting place between captivity and the sea. Here, men were processed in rows, photographed again, searched again. The barracks were bare, the routines stripped of the relative mercy they'd known in Michigan. Outside the wire, the lake wind howled off Lake Michigan, carrying the salt scent of distance. Rumors spread among the men. Some would sail directly to Le Havre, others to British-administered ports before re-entering Germany. No one knew who decided. The uncertainty pressed down harder than the cold. A few tried to escape, though most didn't bother. Escape to what? The old Reich was a ghost now, its capital a grave of stone and smoke. That evening, Karl found himself in a makeshift chapel, drawn by the faint sound of an organ. An American chaplain, middle-aged and weary, was packing away hymn books. When he noticed Karl lingering, he said simply, "You can sit." They shared the silence that often speaks louder than confession. After a moment, the chaplain said, "You worked in Detroit, didn't you?" Karl nodded. The man smiled faintly. "That place changes people. Did it change you?" Karl hesitated. Then, in halting English, it showed how men can build, not destroy. The chaplain's eyes softened. "Then take that home with you. You'll need it." The next morning, orders came. Karl's group would depart from New York Harbor aboard a transport ship, the General W.P. Richardson. He felt an odd sense of gravity, as if each step toward the pier was both forward and backward through time. In the crowded ship's hold, the air smelled of oil, sea salt, and nervous sweat. The Atlantic rolled beneath them, a dark mirror reflecting all they'd lost and what might yet be found. Some men grew seasick, others sang to pass the hours. Carl wrote instead, trying to capture the rhythm of the ocean on paper. Movement without destination, he wrote, but even the sea has a shore. Days into the voyage, the ship passed, within sight of the Statue of Liberty. Word spread quickly. Men rushed to the deck, silent as they stared. For years they had fought under a flag that mocked liberty as weakness. And yet, in that brief sighting, many felt something like awe. Carl sketched her silhouette, the torch lifted against a pale dawn. He didn't know why his throat tightened, only that it did. The journey continued. At night, he lay awake, listening to the deep heartbeat of the engines, remembering the rhythm of the Ford assembly lines, the same industrial pulse, but now softened into something almost tender. He realized that America's greatest power hadn't been its weapons, but its capacity to keep creating in the midst of fear. When the ship finally docked at Le Havre, the prisoners disembarked under grey skies. The air smelled of coal smoke and mud, Europe's tired breath. French soldiers watched them in silence as they were processed and assigned to trains bound for Germany. Carl stepped onto the platform, sketchbook in hand. The horizon was ash and snow, but somewhere beyond it, the first scaffolds of rebuilding waited. He thought again of Detroit, the sparks flying from the welding torches, the ordered choreography of workers moving in rhythm. That image became his private prayer. A factory without hatred, a rhythm that built rather than destroyed. When the train lurched east toward Bremen, Carl pressed his palm to the window glass, feeling the vibration of movement. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The turning point had already happened, not on a battlefield, but in the heart of a man who had once believed order meant obedience, and now understood it meant responsibility. Beyond the rails, Europe rolled by, broken but breathing. And through that breath, the first signs of liberation were beginning to form. March 1946, Bremen. The train clattered through the outskirts of a city that no longer existed. What had once been a port of commerce and life now lay twisted into a geography of ruin. Chimneys standing like blackened bones, walls torn open like wounds. The air itself smelled of lime dust and loss. When the German prisoners disembarked, no one cheered. There were no bands, no flags, no welcomes, only wind blowing through shattered rafters. Karl Brenner stepped down onto the frozen mud of the station yard. Around him, men stumbled forward in disbelief, clutching small bundles and repatriation papers that suddenly seemed absurd. He looked toward the skyline, trying to locate the street where his father's workshop had once stood, but only smoke and empty windows answered. For the first time, he understood that captivity had been a kind of protection. Freedom here meant facing what had been done, and what had been lost forever. British occupation officers processed them quickly. Their orders were to report to the local displaced persons office for housing and rations. Carl received a card stamped temporary residence permit and a ration book that promised little more than survival. The clerk, a weary German woman in a British uniform, glanced at his papers. "Engineer?" she asked in German. He nodded. "Then you'll be useful. They're rebuilding power lines near the Weser." Her tone was factual, almost mechanical, but her eyes softened for a moment before returning to her paperwork. The camp days were over, yet routine clung to them like smoke. Each morning, Carl joined teams of returnees clearing rubble, salvaging bricks, and laying the first beams of reconstruction. The city was silent, except for hammers, the clink of metal, and the echo of absence. Between ruins, makeshift kiosks sold tea brewed from burnt leaves, newspapers printed on brown wrapping paper, and bread that was half sawdust. He found temporary shelter in what had once been a school basement, sharing space with 3 other men from his transport. They spoke little. At night, Carl listened to the wind, whistling through cracked walls, and thought of Battle Creek, of the neat rows of barracks, the scent of coffee, the hum of the electric saw. Here, even silence felt broken. One day, while clearing debris from a bombed warehouse, Carl unearthed a twisted metal plaque. Through the soot, the embossed letters emerged. Krupp AG, 1941. He ran his hand over it slowly. He had built machines once, too. The kind that rolled off lines into war. Now he stood amid their consequences. The irony was unbearable. And yet, in that ruin, something inside him finally released. For the first time since the war began, he wept. Not for the Reich, not for defeat, but for the simple truth that creation and destruction had always been his twin trades. That night, as he sat by a small oil lamp, sketching what remained of the city, an older man approached. His name was Weber, a teacher before the war, thin and hollow-eyed, but carrying a strange light in his voice. "You draw well," he said quietly. "You should show these to the Americans. They need to see what their bombs did, and what we did to deserve them." Carl met his gaze. Would they care? Weber smiled faintly. Some might, and that's enough. They began meeting nightly, sketching the city's recovery, one ruined block at a time. Others joined them. A carpenter, a student, a widow. Together they began documenting the rebirth of Bremen, not as propaganda, but as witness. They called themselves Die Wiederkehrenden, the returnees. By April, a British officer took notice. Lieutenant Hughes, part of the Allied Control Commission, visited their workspace. He leafed through Carl's sketches in silence, pausing on one of the Ford assembly line, drawn from memory. "You saw this in America?" he asked. Carl nodded. Hughes studied the image, the order, the rhythm, the light. "We could use men like you," he said finally. "Not soldiers, builders." In that moment, liberation revealed itself not as an event, but as a slow unfolding. Carl's freedom wasn't marked by gates opening, but by the decision to create again, without command, without ideology. The same hands that once built engines for war were now rebuilding homes, sketching classrooms, redrawing blueprints for power lines that hummed once more across the Weser. One afternoon, while crossing the river on a makeshift ferry, Carl saw a child playing on the bank, launching a small wooden boat into the current. The boy's laughter rose against the cold air, pure and unguarded. The toy drifted out, caught the sun for an instant, and vanished downstream. Carl smiled. For the first time, he didn't reach to retrieve it. The collapse had already given way to something quieter. Not triumph, not redemption, but the patient rhythm of renewal. Yet the final act of liberation would arrive unexpectedly, carried not by soldiers, but by a letter. The letter arrived in early summer, folded into a plain brown envelope, its edges frayed by the handling. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, careful, and unmistakably American. The return address read simply, Battle Creek, Camp Office. Former staff. Carl hesitated before opening it. The air in the small rebuilt workshop hung with sawdust and the scent of fresh pine. The world outside was beginning to hum again with the sounds of labor and rebuilding. He unfolded the paper. "Mr. Brenner, I don't know if this will reach you, but your sketches were found among the materials sent back to the War Department. We kept one, the drawing of the Ford assembly line, with the note you wrote beneath it. Freedom is movement toward understanding. It now hangs in our training hall. I thought you'd want to know that your words stayed with us. Sergeant Daniel Moore, U.S. Army, Battle Creek Camp." Carl read it twice, his fingers tracing the faint imprint of the signature. The message felt like a bridge across an ocean. One built not of steel or politics, but of memory. For months, he had worked without knowing whether any of what he'd seen or changed within himself mattered. Now, a single sheet of paper said that it did. He showed the letter to Weber, who smiled through the soft dust of the workshop. "So," the old teacher said, "even the victors remember." Carl shook his head. "No, the men do. That's different." That night, Carl walked through the ruins of Bremen once more. The air was warmer now. Flowers had begun to push through the cracks of the pavements, stubborn as hope. Along the riverbank, new scaffolds reached toward the skyline. He paused, listening to the hammering, rhythmic, deliberate, echoing the same industrial heartbeat he had first heard in Detroit. But this time, it wasn't foreign. It was his. In the weeks that followed, he joined the early Reconstruction Bureau as a draftsman. His days filled again with lines, measurements, elevations, but no longer for the sake of domination. He designed bridges, housing frames, power conduits. The sound of rebuilding became his redemption. Each pencil stroke was a quiet refusal to return to the past. By late 1946, Bremen's main power station flickered to life for the first time since the war. When the turbines began to spin, a cheer rippled through the workers. Carl stood among them, his hands trembling. The vibration of the generator beneath his feet felt eerily familiar, the same mechanical pulse that had once powered destruction, now driving light into darkness. He closed his eyes and felt the machine's rhythm merge with his heartbeat. In his notebook, he wrote, "To build is to forgive the world its brokenness." Months later, an American journalist visited the city to document the reconstruction effort. She carried a camera and a worn press badge. When she asked to interview him, Carl hesitated. "I was once your prisoner," he said. She smiled gently. "Then maybe that's exactly why we should talk." They walked through the rebuilt streets as she asked about his time in the United States. Carl spoke of the factory tours, the discipline of production, the strange kindness of guards who offered cigarettes instead of orders. "It was not what I expected," he said. "We thought we'd see propaganda, but we saw people working together, without fear." The journalist nodded and took his photograph. A quiet man in work clothes, standing amid bricks and scaffolds, sunlight on his hands. Weeks later, that photograph appeared in a small column of an American newspaper beneath the headline, "Former POW Helps Rebuild Bremen." Carl never saw it himself, but Sergeant Moore did, clipping it carefully and pinning it beside the sketch that still hung in the Battle Creek office. In a way, both men were free now, each holding a fragment of the same story, one written in pencil, the other in memory. By 1947, Carl's letters began reaching former comrades scattered across Germany. Some had found work rebuilding railways. Others struggled in the rubble zones of Hamburg or Dresden. To each, he wrote the same closing line. Remember what we saw, the lines that built, not the ones that destroyed. Freedom, he realized, wasn't given. It was practiced, drawn, and redrawn in daily labor, conversation, and forgiveness. That winter, Karl walked once more to the Weser River, now flowing clear after months of dredging. He stood on a half-built bridge, the cold wind sharp against his face. Behind him, the city pulsed again with life. Markets reopening, children playing, bells ringing faintly from a repaired church tower. He opened his notebook to the last blank page and drew the Detroit assembly line once more. But this time, the workers' faces were indistinct, merging into one continuous rhythm of motion. Beneath it, he wrote the date, Bremen, December 1947. He closed the book and looked toward the horizon, where smoke no longer meant destruction, but creation. The long captivity was over, not because gates had opened, but because he had finally learned what to do with freedom. The wind carried the faint echo of hammering across the river, steady, alive, unending. In that rhythm, the story of survival became the story of rebuilding, and the silence of the camps gave way to the hum of a new world being made by human hands. Spring 1956. A decade had passed since Karl Brenner first stood before the Ford assembly line, staring at the roaring choreography of American industry that had quietly dismantled his faith in tyranny. Now, the same rhythm played softly beneath his own life, not through machines, but through the steady pulse of rebuilding. Bremen hummed again. Electric lights glowed across bridges he had helped design. Trams rattled through streets reborn from ash, and schoolchildren's laughter replaced the silence of ruins. Karl, now in his mid-40s, lived in a modest apartment near the Weser. His drafting table faced a window overlooking the river, and beside it sat the old sketchbook he had carried since Battle Creek. The pages had yellowed, but the lines still spoke. Engines, rooftops, the rough hands of men working together. It was less a book of war than of motion, the testament of a man who had learned that survival was not enough. One had to build again to give shape to meaning. Each morning, as the trams rang past, Karl would light his stove, pour coffee into a chipped enamel cup, and begin drawing. But his new sketches weren't of factories. They were of people. Dock workers, widows at market stalls, children playing with handmade kites near the riverbank. He said little about his time in America, except to those who asked carefully. It was strange, he would tell them, to see a nation win by making, not destroying. One afternoon, a visitor arrived, a young German journalist researching the former POWs who had been held in the United States. She carried a small recorder and a notepad filled with names. Herr Brenner, she began, many have said their captivity changed them. Do you think it changed you? Karl smiled faintly, folding his hands over the table. Yes, he said. It showed me the cost of obedience without conscience, and the power of building with purpose. The machines of Detroit were loud, but beneath that noise was something very quiet. Dignity. He reached for the old sketchbook, opening to the page where the Ford line curved into infinity. The pencil lines were smudged now, but the motion remained clear. We thought freedom was the absence of control, he continued. But I learned it was the presence of trust, men trusting each other to build something greater than themselves. The journalist nodded, writing quickly. Then she asked, "And what did you feel when you saw it for the first time?" Karl looked out the window. The sun, was setting over Bremen, throwing amber light across the water. A kind of shock, he said quietly. Not from fear, from recognition. The enemy I saw wasn't America. It was our own blindness. After she left, Karl sat in silence for a long time. The city outside glowed in the evening light, street lamps flickering to life one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle sounded, gentler now, less commanding, almost like a heartbeat. He stood, crossed to his drafting table, and began sketching again. This time, it wasn't a machine or a face, but an idea, a bridge, arcing between two shores. On one side, the ruins of a city, on the other, a field of motion, workers, cranes, rivers of light. Above it, he wrote a single word, Verständnis, understanding. A knock at the door interrupted his work. It was Weber, older, stooped, his eyes still bright with the calm wisdom that had first anchored Karl's recovery. They shared tea and silence, as they often did. Weber unfolded a newspaper clipping from America, yellowed and fragile. From a friend, he said, handing it over. Karl adjusted his glasses. The headline read, German POWs sketch still hangs in Michigan Hall. Below it, a small photograph showed his own drawing of the assembly line, now framed beside a new sign that read, Forging Freedom. He didn't speak for a while. The room filled with the gentle tick of the wall clock and the smell of the river drifting through the open window. Then quietly he said, So it wasn't forgotten after all. Weber nodded. Nothing drawn with truth ever is. Outside, the evening deepened into quiet blue. Somewhere, a church bell rang, slow, resonant, familiar. Karl thought of that first day in Detroit, the hiss of the machines, the smell of oil and steel, the disbelief in the eyes of his fellow prisoners. The sound that had once overwhelmed him now felt like memory's heartbeat, proof that history could turn from violence to creation. He closed the newspaper and looked toward the river again. The water caught the city's lights, carrying them downstream, like small fragments of fire. Somewhere beyond that current was a country that had once held him captive, and in doing so had taught him how to be free. The war was long over, but the hum endured, steady, human, unbroken. And within that hum, the story of captivity found its quiet release. Autumn 1961. The leaves along the Weser had begun to turn gold again, falling like slow rain across the rebuilt city. Bremen now thrived, its cranes stretching above new docks, its schools filled with children who had never heard an air raid siren. The war had receded into history, but its shadow still lingered in the spaces between generations. Karl Brenner walked along the riverfront one cool morning, his coat buttoned high, the sketchbook, now battered and nearly full, tucked under his arm. He passed the familiar statue of Roland, the city's medieval guardian, and paused for a moment beneath it. How strange, he thought, that symbols of freedom could survive empires, bombings, and the tides of belief. Freedom, he had learned, was not a flag. It was persistence, the quiet act of rebuilding what was once destroyed. In recent years, he had begun speaking occasionally at local schools about his time as a prisoner in America. The children listened with wide eyes, expecting tales of cruelty, perhaps escape. Instead, he told them about factories, the roar of the Rouge plant, the workers moving in unity, the rhythm of creation. We were shown how strength could build instead of break, he told them. That was my real liberation. One afternoon, a teacher asked him to bring something for the students to see. He brought the sketch of the Ford line, still carefully preserved between the pages of his notebook. The classroom fell silent as he placed it on the desk. The children leaned forward, tracing the pencil lines with their eyes, rows of men and machines, light glinting across motion. A small boy raised his hand. "Did they let you draw this while you were a prisoner?" Carl smiled. "They didn't stop me," he said softly. "Sometimes understanding begins when no one stops you from seeing." After the lesson, he lingered by the window, watching the children leave, their laughter rising like the sound of a new century beginning. He realized that none of them carried the burden of the world he once knew, and that, perhaps, was the truest victory. That night, he returned home to his apartment by the river. The city glowed outside, lights rippling on the water, the faint hum of factories in the distance. On his table lay a letter postmarked from Michigan. It was from the son of Sergeant Daniel Moore. "Dear Mr. Brenner, my father passed recently. Among his things we found your drawing and the article about Bremen's rebuilding. He kept them together, folded neatly all these years. He used to say, 'The man who drew this taught me that wars don't end when the guns stop. They end when men decide to build again. I thought you should know.'" Carl read the letter by lamplight, the words trembling in his hands. He felt something unnameable rise within him. Not pride, not sorrow, but a quiet peace. For 20 years, a line drawn in a Michigan camp had bridged 2 lives, 2 nations, 2 wounds. He walked to his window and looked out at the river, its current silver under the moon. The sound of the city reached him. Trams, footsteps, laughter, a distant whistle. It was the same pulse he had once heard in the assembly lines, transformed now into the music of life itself. He sat at his drafting table one last time, opened his notebook to the final blank page, and began to draw. Not a machine this time, nor a bridge, nor a ruin. He drew the river, wide, calm, endless, flowing between 2 shores that no longer feared each other. When he finished, he signed it quietly. Carl Brenner, Bremen, 1961. He placed the letter beside it, closed the book, and left the lamp burning low. Outside, the hum of the world continued, a soft rhythm of motion, work, and forgiveness. History, he thought, is not made by the noise of guns, but by the hands that rebuild afterward. The clock ticked, the light dimmed, and the city, alive again, whispered through its bridges and streets the promise that understanding, once born, never truly dies. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.